leaders. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners, First Nations people, all around the country in which we're variously meeting today, and pay my respects to them, and thank you for joining in today. So without further ado, let's jump to Rachel and hear about this extraordinary work that she's been involved in. And Rachel, welcome not only to delivering an ARI seminar for us today, but welcome to ARI. It's wonderful to have you and Jos joining our staff. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Fern. It's wonderful to be speaking to you today. My name is Rachel Leihy. So I'm a community ecologist working in the ecological analysis and synthesis group at the Arthur Rylah Institute. But as Fern mentioned, I'm fairly new to ARI. I joined in October last year. And so it's really fantastic to have this opportunity today to introduce myself to my new colleagues at DELP and to speak a bit about my previous research working on Antarctic ecosystems. And then at the very end, I'll just touch on what I'm going to be working on at ARI. Today, I'm joining you from Bunurong country, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd like to talk to you about some work I've done quantifying Antarctica's wilderness and biodiversity value. And just at the top of this talk, I'd like to understand that in a lot of discourses, the term wilderness can be quite contentious. And today I'm focusing really specifically on Antarctica's wilderness value, which has a specific meaning in Antarctic law and under the Antarctic Treaty System. And when I speak to you about Antarctica today, I'm really talking about the area south of 60 degrees south. So that's the area that's covered by the international treaty. And a lot of the decisions about conservation across the continent are made by consensus from a number of different nations in forums like their annual meetings. Antarctic ecosystems range from the relatively biodiverse coastal margins of the continent, where we find lots of our emblematic species like penguins and other seabirds, but also diverse moss communities and lichens and invertebrates. And then there's the inland dry valleys and the vast interior polar plateau, where biodiversity is much more sparse. I completed my honours PhD and postdoctoral research at Monash University, where I looked not only at the continent's biodiversity, but also at the biodiversity of the islands that encircle Antarctica in the Southern Ocean. And I was fortunate enough to visit some of these sub-Antarctic islands for fieldwork, mostly surveying insect and plant communities. And it's through this research that I've broadly focused on two themes. So the first is looking to understand the environmental drivers of biodiversity patterns. And I've looked at, for example, how invasive alien species affect macroecological patterns in species richness, composition, and species turnover, but also at the remarkable case of insect flight loss across the sub-Antarctic islands and exploring its drivers. My second research theme broadly seeks to identify environmental values that are not well represented in current conservation policies and practices, and to provide spatially explicit and quantitative evidence for these values to help inform conservation decisions. And today I'd like to discuss my work looking at wilderness and species-based area protection in Antarctica. So when we think about wilderness in Antarctica, it's perhaps difficult to imagine any other place on Earth that's more resolutely wild. Over the span of human history, it's been one of the last places on Earth that we've sought to inhabit and to understand. But at the same time, over the last few centuries and continuing into the last few decades, we've seen catastrophic and ongoing declines in the global wilderness estate. And so there have been a number of high-profile papers that have documented these declines, but Antarctica is often excluded from these, either because it's considered to be data deficient or assumed to be relatively well protected. But threats to Antarctica continue to grow. So the nations that formed the Antarctic Treaty System continue to build new stations and camps across the continent. So they're expanding their infrastructure footprint. And at the same time, tourism activities have increased rapidly, both in terms of the number of people that are transported to the continent each year, but also the number of sites that they visit and the diversity of activities that take place in their itineraries. And so in the last year before COVID, more than 55,000 tourists were landed on the continent, and even more participated in Antarctic cruises. And although our direct imprint or footprint on the continent is still quite limited compared to elsewhere, Antarctic ecosystems and environments are thought to be highly sensitive to disturbance. So to illustrate this, researchers walked between these two piles of rocks in the Ross Sea region 200 times. And when they came back 17 years later, the path was still really visible. So just for context, Antarctic cruise ships can land up to 100 people per landing, and they can make multiple landings in a day. So there's the risk then that even short visits to Antarctica can have really long-term effects. And those could be vegetation trampling, the introduction of alien species, the transfer of indigenous species between areas that have been isolated from each other for hundreds or thousands of years, and also biological or chemical contamination. The impacts of human activity are also compounded by the threat of alien species invasions and the anticipated and increasingly observed effects of climate change. So the map on the left shows the projected expansion of the ice-free area on the continent due to ice melt by the end of the century. And so it's expected that this is going to be especially pronounced in the Antarctic Peninsula region, which is where most of the human activity takes place. And while climate change is expected to have significant effects for Antarctic species, it's also expected to create more suitable habitat for alien species invasions. So recognizing the need to protect the environmental condition of Antarctica, the Antarctic Treaty Parties began to consider conservation measures since they formed the treaty. And in 1991, they established the Protocol on Environmental Protection. And this protocol set Antarctica aside as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. But it also sets out a number of conservation measures to protect the continent, including these criteria for establishing Antarctic specially protected areas. And so they include a number of different values, but I'll just list them. Those are areas to be kept inviolate or unvisited by people, representative ecosystems, important or unusual assemblages. So that could be breeding colonies of seabirds, the type locality or only known habitat of any species, areas of interest to scientific research, areas with outstanding geological or glaciological value or outstanding wilderness value, or historic sites. And then there's a ninth value that captures any combination of the others. So currently there's only 75 protected areas on the continent. But there are a number of limitations with the current network. And so firstly, while the number and the size of marine protected areas continues to grow, the number of protected areas on land has plateaued in recent decades, and currently the entire network covers about 0.02% of the continent. And secondly, the creation of new protected areas in Antarctica hasn't followed the systematic environmental geographic framework that was set out in the protocol. So the representation of those values within the network is skewed, and a lot of the current protected areas have been established to protect areas with important or unusual assemblages, and more than 90% of the protected areas cover those values that I've highlighted there. So it's these remaining often overlooked values that I've sought to pull together spatially explicit evidence that's needed to advance their protection with my colleagues. And so that's areas that are kept inviolate from human interference, the type locality or only known habitat of any species, and outstanding wilderness areas. So the aims of these projects were to quantify the extent of wilderness and inviolate areas across Antarctica, to determine how many Antarctic species type localities are protected by the existing network of Antarctic specially protected areas, but also how many new areas would be needed to conserve all of those type localities in a representative network. And lastly, we sought to evaluate the options that Antarctic Treaty Parties have before them to discharge their obligations under the protocol to better protect Antarctica's environment. And so the idea of what is and is not a wilderness area can be quite context specific and also contentious. but generally speaking, most quantitative definitions of wilderness try to capture the idea that wilderness areas are large, remote places with most of their historical habitat intact and with little or no evidence of people. Inviolate areas are more specific. So these are pristine places that are thought to be unvisited by people. So in the Antarctic continent context, they could be considered areas with outstanding wilderness value. But they're also extremely valuable as scientific baselines against which we can compare human impact from places that have been more modified by human activity. Type localities are sites where species were first collected or described, and so they allow taxonomists to recollect specimens if the original materials are lost or damaged or destroyed. And so it's pretty unusual to consider species type localities in a protected areas network. And I'm not aware of any other networks elsewhere outside Antarctica that have been established specifically to conserve species type localities. But in Antarctica, it's the only criteria for area protection that allows for the conservation of any species, even if we know very little about its habitat or its distribution, which is unfortunately the case for most species. So we approach these questions by first compiling a comprehensive database of human activity records for the continent, spanning from the first explorers to the present day. And we tried to include any higher resolution records of stations, camps, tourism activity, scientific surveys, and overland traverses. And we excluded aerial surveys and remote sense data. In total, we had about 2.7 million records of human activity, and we used that to calculate impact scores for Antarctic sites that weighted the frequency of human visitation to each site by the extent and the connectivity of ice-free areas. And so this was used to delineate between sites that had been frequently visited with sensitive substrates from places that had no or very few human records. And we used this data to calculate the area of wilderness for the entire continent using 6 different definitions of wilderness. So to explain these definitions, I'll just show some little insert maps for this area in the Ross Sea region. And here the different colours indicate the wilderness areas under different definitions, and the non-wilderness areas are in grey. So the first definition we pulled from elsewhere that looks at globally significant wilderness areas. So these are large areas that are more than 10,000 square kilometres, that are more than 70% intact, and they have fewer than 5 people per square kilometre. So under that definition, the entire terrestrial part of the insert area that we're looking at, but also the entire continent, could be considered a globally significant wilderness. Alternatively, if we exclude sites that have human infrastructure or sites that are even within a visible distance of human infrastructure from the wilderness estate, most of the focus area here, and indeed the continent, is still considered a wilderness area, and the non-wilderness areas are in grey. The next 2 measures of wilderness we designed bespoke to Antarctica to try and capture this idea that Antarctica's wilderness is exceptionally pristine. So we used the human activity records to create a weighted human impact score, and then we identified a threshold above which we considered those sites to be likely impacted by human activity. For all the other sites, we consider those to be our negligibly impacted Antarctic wilderness. Alternatively, for inviolate Antarctic wilderness areas, we were seeking large areas that are contiguous and they have absolutely no record of human activity. And so for this section of the Ross Sea region, human activity has actually been quite extensive, and so none of it would qualify as an inviolate wilderness area. And lastly, we created a definition of wilderness that tries to capture this idea that wilderness areas should be biologically important. So we intersected the negligibly impacted Antarctic wilderness area by the ice-free area of the continent to acknowledge that most Antarctic species rely on ice-free habitat for their survival. And so the key outcome of this paper was that under most definitions of wilderness, between 99 to 100% of the continent qualifies as a wilderness area. So this is perhaps unsurprising, and it makes Antarctica one of the largest and most pristine wildernesses on Earth. But it presents a challenge for the Antarctic Treaty Parties. They have committed to protecting Antarctica's wilderness value in a series of protected areas. But on a wilderness continent, which areas then have the most significant wilderness value? So one approach could be to conserve the inviolate wilderness areas that cover about 32% of the continent, and mostly across the vast interior polar plateau. These areas have great scientific value as pristine baselines against which we can compare human impacts elsewhere. It's also unlikely that we would find these kinds of places anywhere else on Earth, and especially not at this scale. But the actual extent of wilderness and inviolate areas is probably a lot smaller than we estimated, because some human records have likely gone unrecorded or they're not digitized. Likewise, data coverage favors Western countries, and very recent activity likely hasn't been captured yet or published. Wilderness areas are also generally valued for their significance for biodiversity and their ecosystem services, but relatively few of the biodiversity significant sites in Antarctica are captured within either the negligibly impacted Antarctic wilderness or the inviolate Antarctic wilderness. So whether that's the ice-free ecoregions, the important bird areas or biodiversity records, or the Antarctic specially protected areas that have already been designated for their biodiversity value. And that's because people have repeatedly visited some of the most biodiverse parts of the continent, and research stations and tourism activities often compete with biodiversity for space on the relatively restricted ice-free area sections of the continent. So protecting Antarctica's wilderness and its inviolate value is important for protecting the environmental condition of Antarctica, but we need another approach to ensure that Antarctic species and ecosystems are conserved. And so next we explored the utility of the type locality criterion. So to assess how area protection could be applied to species type localities, we first created a list of all of the described species from terrestrial and lacustrine habitats across Antarctica. And so we excluded some taxonomic groups that haven't been, that aren't well resolved and have rapidly changing taxonomies. So in total, our data set included 1,142 species, mostly dominated by lichens, mosses, mites, tardigrades, and rotifers. And for each species, we referred to their original species descriptions to find their type locality. And we then excluded some species because their type localities were outside the Antarctic Treaty Area, or they were vague or imprecise. And so an example of this is the type locality of the Adelie penguin, whose type locality is Adelie land, which is about 400,000 square kilometres. And we can contrast that to the type locality of the moss species, the lichen species below that, whose type locality is Forefield Rock, which is a very specific place in McRobinson Land. And so we used 25 kilometres squared as our threshold in order to maximise the representation of species in our data set. And when we overlaid the type localities with the existing Antarctic Specially Protected Areas network, we found that about 28% of them were already, and perhaps serendipitously already, within the Protected Areas network. And so those are the green points on the map on the left, and they're represented in about 41 of the 66 terrestrial aspers. But the remaining 278 type localities are unprotected, and it would take establishing another 105 new protected areas in order to capture all of those species in the network. And there are a couple of challenges here, and I'll just touch on one or two now. So creating this many new protected areas explicitly for type localities would more than double the number of Antarctic specially protected areas, and it would nearly double the total area of the network. So this would greatly increase the management burden placed on Antarctic Treaty Parties to monitor and administer these areas, and also to routinely update their management plans. There's also the challenge of taxonomic revision, and so any species-based area protection approach is potentially vulnerable to this. Our species list represents our understanding of biodiversity at a fixed point in time. But as we know, taxonomy is constantly evolving as new species are discovered and others are split or grouped. So there's the risk then that you might establish two protected areas for two seemingly unique species, which are later grouped together, calling into question the validity of those areas. Nonetheless, there are a couple of actions that the Antarctic Treaty Parties could take to better conserve the continent's wilderness and biodiversity value. And so firstly, they could adopt a systematic conservation planning approach to identify areas with multiple ecological or environmental values. So that might be places with type localities, but also wilderness value or geological value or historic sites. Second, they could refocus the type locality criterion on species habitat. And so if you recall, the criterion stated the type locality or only known habitat of any species. But species habitats often more extensive than a single site, and so this would increase the likelihood that it could be captured within a protected areas network. It would also offer the treaty parties some more flexibility to protect high quality habitat or well-connected ecosystems, or places where species are more likely to persist into the future, which may or may not be their type locality. Unfortunately, we don't know a lot about the species habitats or their distributions for most Antarctic species, and biological surveys aren't currently a priority for most Antarctic treaty parties. And lastly, there are other conservation measures in the protocol that could be used to better conserve Antarctica's places and its biodiversity, such as the Antarctic Specially Managed Areas. So that's been a bit of a rapid overview of two related projects looking at area protection in Antarctica. But in my new role at ARI, I'm going to be tackling some modelling and decision science problems a bit closer to home. So at ARI, I'm working on developing spatial models and decision support tools for wetland and fire management projects. And I'm also going to be contributing to the Strategic Management Prospects framework for prioritising actions for biodiversity outcomes in Victoria. And I'll just end on my acknowledgement slides and thank you all for listening.
I don't know if you can hear the clapping, but I'm doing my best there.
Thanks.
I'm clapping. Can you hear me? It seems so strange, doesn't it? Rachel, I'm pretty sure that everybody online is applauding in multiple ways. One, you've given us a really tremendous understanding of how to support wilderness and species conservation in Antarctica in a really terrific way. Thank you so much. And I think many people will also have been really absorbed just by the photos. It's a very beautiful talk as well as a really informative one. And we can really see how this kind of understanding and spatial analysis and decision making is going to help us with the work that we do at ARI. So tremendous. Thank you so much. I'm just going to check. I don't think we have any questions. I'm just jumping in to check whether there are any new questions there. You might see that I've belatedly typed in the Q&A thing there. If people have questions, please type them in and we can put them to Rachel. We'll do the same with Jos throughout her presentation. Rachel, I might just ask you this might be putting you on the spot a bit. What would be the question that you would really like somebody to ask? I know that whenever I do a presentation, there's so many things that I can't fit into the presentation, and I think, oh, if I had an extra 5 minutes, what's the thing that I would really love to have included in there? So what is it that you'd like to add, given that I can't see other question yet?
Well, I guess what I could discuss is how our conservation of Antarctica really, how that relates to conservation more broadly and outside of Antarctica. So Antarctica is quite a really unique situation in a lot of ways in that we don't have any urban centres or industry or agricultural land use. So in a lot of ways, there's an exceptional opportunity there to really protect something that's unique, that's globally unique, and also to help meet our international targets that we have to the global protected areas estate. And so little of the continent, despite the fact that we don't have a lot of these competing uses for it, is actually formally protected. And so I think there's a real opportunity there to sort of expand that protected areas network, given that we know that we have a lot of impacts on Antarctica, but also Antarctica impacts us, and a lot of the way that we think that future climate change is going to play out is really going to depend on what happens to the continent. And it's going to affect Australia, for instance, and global sea level, and there's lots of things that there's an interdependence in across the Earth system, and so it's not quite as remote, I guess, as it might appear, given that I guess we don't really consider it a lot in our sort of day-to-day thinking.
I've often thought that although it seems like no one owns Antarctica, in fact, we are all Antarcticans, because we all do rely on Antarctica so much, and Antarctica has such an influence on the rest of us. And I think that example of international collaboration and the opportunity for international collaboration could be so important in so many other things in the world right now. So it's an incredibly useful and interesting example to think about. Look, perhaps we'll jump over to Jos. Thank you so much, Rachel. Terrific talk. Thank you so much.
And we do have just one question that's come through.
I missed it.
Do you mind if we ask it?
That's
okay.
Right, Andy. You go, Andy. Read it out. I'm still turning around.
So Rachel, thank you so much for the talk. The question here is around examples of regenerative tourism in Antarctica, or if there's any positive outcomes from tourism that you've seen.
So there's lots of positive outcomes from tourism in that when we go to places and we visit them and experience them, we're really made aware of their value. And so all tourists can be considered, I guess, stewards of Antarctica, and they can go home and sort of impress upon, their own communities and, politicians and everyone who's involved in the management of Antarctica, its value. And so experiencing Antarctica is one way that we can really recognize its conservation value. And so tourism does have a positive role to play, definitely, in raising awareness about the value of Antarctica and also the threats that it's facing.
Awesome. Well said. Thank you very much. And I'm going to throw the fern to introduce you to Joslin. And
I'm also going to add, what about citizen science? Think of all the citizen science that some of those tourists do. Good on them. Fabulous. So yes, let's jump to Jos now. Thank you so much, Jos, for joining us as well. It's another decision tool type talk that we're going to hear from Joslin today. So these make a really lovely pair of talks to think about together. Jos is also going to give us a little bit of an introduction herself as to her background and the things that have brought her to join us at ARI. So here to talk about quantitative tools for conservation management, Jos Moore. Thanks so much, Jos. Over to you.
Thanks, Fern. I think. I'm not quite sure. I can't actually tell when I'm on.
You're good. Good to go.
Great. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Dja Dja Wurrung, and the Wurundjeri people on whose land I live and work, and note that no treaty was ever signed or country ceded. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and thank any traditional owners or First Nations people that are joining us today, as well as everyone else for coming. So I moved from Monash Uni to ARI in December, and so today I just thought I would briefly introduce myself and then just talk about one recent research project I've been working on, looking to identify priorities for willow control in eastern Victoria. So I'm a quantitative ecologist. I did an undergraduate in chemistry and maths, and then I did a PhD in theoretical plant ecology. You might be able to tell from this photo and the themes of my research, I love alpine and subalpine areas, especially alpine meadows and bogs. And it always happens. So one of my big interests is plant community ecology, and I'm part of the Nutrient Network Global Experiment, which has 50 sites, started off with about 50 sites in 2008, and it's now getting up to 100. We're all doing exactly the same experiment in different places all around the world. And the aim of this experiment is to understand how resource availability and herbivory structure grasslands, their composition, and also affect their ecosystem function. But when I say grasslands, I'm talking about the vegetation community. So this is really important because these two processes are changing a lot due to human influence. We've really increased the amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere, and we've completely changed the distribution of vertebrate herbivores across the globe. So, you know, it's a really important experiment. It's provided a lot of insights. My site is in near Falls Creek on the Bogong High Plains. So another focus of my work, and one I'm going to talk more about today, is decision making and quantifying trade-offs between different actions or objectives that can help guide conservation management. So I've used decision theory to assess the potential for conflict between humans and vertebrates in Africa. So this was some early work that I did. All of the coloured squares here have got high conservation value in terms of biodiversity representation of vertebrates. But the red cells also have very high population density, and we considered that these were places that had high potential for conflict with sort of for biodiversity and humans needing to share the land. I've also examined the trade-off between quarantine and surveillance to minimise the impact of rat invasion on islands. In this case, it was Barrow Island. And I've done a bunch of structured decision-making workshops and worked with managers and used decision theory to improve management of a bunch of things, but I've worked a lot on managing invasive plants. So acacia in South Africa, but a lot on willow, in particularly on the Bogong High Plains, but also in eastern Victoria. I'll talk about that a lot more in a minute, and also hawkweed in the Australian Alps. And this sort of decision work has also led to on-ground studies of ecology and management. So I've done a bunch of different experiments estimating plant detectability for both willow and hawkweed, thinking about humans, and more recently evaluating the effectiveness of detective dogs. So this is work that I've done a lot in collaboration with Cindy Hauser, and we have a PhD student working on evaluating detection dogs at the moment. I also have been doing a bunch of research on alpine and subalpine peatlands ecology, or bogs, sphagnum bogs, peatlands. I'm going to use them a bit interchangeably today. So one thing I'm working on at the moment is we're trying to figure out how we can monitor moisture availability and hydrology over time, sort of extensively across the landscape. We're trying to link on-ground measurements and remote sensing to try and sort of develop a sort of monitoring network that means that hopefully we can identify any peatlands early if they're in trouble, peatlands that are vulnerable, and maybe intervene. I've also been working with managers and researchers to identify the effectiveness of different kinds of management interventions for the conservation of peatlands, as well as identifying key knowledge gaps that we would like to fill. And so we identified in a recent workshop last year, we identified 25 key questions that would help contribute to that. And this year I'm a contributing author to the Global Peatlands Assessment, which is being run by UNEP and coordinated by the World Conservation Monitoring Centre. What I really wanted to talk to you about today was this recent work that I've been doing with Steph Carter. She did honours with me last year, looking at how to prioritise willow across eastern Victoria. This is building on a bunch of work modelling seed dispersal that I've done previously, and also another project that Steph and I did with Cindy Hauser and Matt White last year. So the issue is, there's about 400 willow taxa species-ish worldwide, and about 100 have been introduced into Australia. They're the entire genus, except for 3 different sort of horticulturally important taxa, are classified as a weed of national significance. This map here shows in the olivey green colour their willow records, the dark blue are rivers. You can see there's very widespread across eastern Victoria. So the question is, where should we control this willow across the landscape? So I'll just give you a quick bit of background about willow, and then I'll talk a bit more about the decision problem. So willows propagate very easily from cuttings. So you can just break off a twig, plant it put it in the ground, it will sprout roots. You know, amazing. So they propagate very easily, they grow fast, and they form extensive root mats. So they were widely used for soil stabilisation along waterways and around dams from European arrival until about the 1980s. Yeah, and so they can spread really easily downstream via broken stems. They're also very tolerant of disturbance, and they can resprout after fire. They have some negative ecological impacts as well. So this fast-growing, dense root mat actually in the longer term becomes a real problem. They grow into the waterway and they basically cause erosion around it. So you end up with erosion, eroding waterways. As well as that, there are deciduous species. This is unusual in an Australian aquatic ecosystem or a riparian system. And that nutrient pulse in autumn is unusual for an Australian aquatic ecosystem and not good. They also have higher water use than other native riparian species. There's also one special willow, which is this species that's the photo of here, is Salix cinerea grey sallow willow. And this willow is also invading alpine and subalpine sphagnum bogs and sphagnums, which are an EPBC listed vegetation community. So it's an unusual species in that it can grow in peatlands as well as in riparian areas. And it's also unusual for Australia because it produces seed. So most other willows don't produce seed in Australia. So these seeds are very small and they can go a long way. So people, it's been estimated that they can go tens of kilometres and that they can cross catchments. So the question is really, how do we manage these willows across this landscape? And there were kind of two objectives. So this management is being undertaken for the purpose of sort of the environment for conservation and biodiversity conservation. So the first objective is really thinking about managing willow in locations that will minimise the threat to biodiversity. And through a series of workshops with CMAs, Parks Victoria and DELP, they identified that the specific biodiversity of concern here were 27 aquatic and riparian rare or threatened species, the sphagnum bogs and associated fens vegetation community, and also native vegetation along waterways more broadly. So that is the 29th biodiversity feature that we're looking to protect here. So we've got 29 different kinds of biodiversity that we're trying to protect by controlling willow in the landscape. But the second thing that we're concerned about is this idea about reducing future dispersal threat. So there's limited value, I guess, in doing a whole bunch of control if then 5 years later you come back and it's just a big reinfestation. And because willow spreads so easily, both especially downstream, one of the big concerns is to try and make sure that you control in locations to minimise that. So you try and maximise the lengths of the stretches that you control in, and particularly that you try and start from the top of the headwaters and move down. So we measured that by calculating the proportion of area upstream of a candidate location that had also been measured, been controlled, sorry, and that is upstream connectivity. So we want to maximise that as much as possible, with this idea that then it means that there is less potential for downstream dispersal. I know it's confusing, upstream, downstream, but so we're trying to maximise upstream connectivity to reduce vegetative dispersal along waterways. The second thing which we did in this restricted area here, in this rectangle here, was also we did a second analysis thinking about trying to minimise seed dispersal potential as threat as well. And so we did that for this restricted area because this was the area in which we had a model of seed dispersal potential. So for seeds to be able to disperse a long way, they need to be able to escape the canopy, so they're in the airstream basically. And it also depends on the wind patterns at the time that these seeds are released, which is in spring. So we went through a big process to model that, which I'm not going to talk about today, but we have predictions of that seed dispersal potential for this rectangle. This is also where the sort of the focus of the Salix cinerea invasion is, which is the one that has the wind dispersed seeds. Okay, so how did we do this? So the first thing we did was think about this, how did we calculate this threat to biodiversity? So we calculate threat to biodiversity. So we made Steph made a willow suitability model, habitat distribution model to predict willow the relative likelihood of willows across the landscape based on previous observations. And then we adjusted this to account for where previous control effort had been made. We multiplied that by the habitat distribution models of those 29 biodiversity features that we were concerned with to make 29 individual current threat to biodiversity layers. So and this is an example of the alpine bog skink. So basically places that had high likelihood of the species being present and a high likelihood of the willows being present have a high threat score, and it's these locations that we're trying to target. Because if we removed willow from these locations, that would confer a high benefit. So we're trying to identify those locations. So how did we do that? So we used a conservation planning approach to try and represent, benefit all of those 29 biodiversity features together. So we used zonation, which basically ranks the landscape in order of priority of where you can control, taking account of where you have undertaken your management previously. So we used catchments rather than grid cells, just because this was a waterways problem. We had our threat to biodiversity layers, and we also tried to minimise cost and preferenced areas that were in good general condition as indicated by their land use. So this is a similar approach to the strategic management prospects, which also uses a zonation type algorithm. In this case, we're just looking at one kind of threat, which is willow invasion, and a specific set of values that are affected by that threat. So just these 29 particular biodiversity features. It's a little bit different because as well as trying to represent all of the biodiversity, we're thinking about this trade-off with this future threat of willow control. So we're trying to allocate our effort not just to manage biodiversity now, but also think about this other objective about minimising dispersal in the future. We did, as I said, we did these two different dispersal analyses. One for freshwater, thinking about connectivity, and one for seed dispersal. So how did we go? So this is a priority map for where to control willow across eastern Victoria when you're just trying to represent biodiversity. The yellow areas are the top 25%. The hotter it gets, the smaller the area, and the sort of higher priority the area is what I mean, with red being the top 2%. So you can see we're focused in East Gippsland, the northeast, the alpine areas, particularly around the Bogong High Plains, Baw Baw, We also try and maximise upstream connectivity. So think about this minimising dispersal opportunity. You can see that that really consolidates where we put our effort. So that hasn't changed the broad regions, but it's changed the specific locations quite a bit. That come at a cost to our ability to represent biodiversity. And we can look at that by looking at this performance curve. So this curve here shows the percentage of the landscape managed, so which priority it is, starting from 0, and it just goes up to 25, and the background colour matches the colour on the map. So this is the 2% highest priority, then 5, 10, 25, etc. On the Y, we've got the total threat to biodiversity managed. So, but this is calculated for each feature separately. So the solid line here is the average value. So this is the average proportion of the threat of each biodiversity feature managed. Blue is for when we're just thinking about biodiversity. So that's how well we can do. And then the purple colour is when we also are trying to account for connectivity. So you can see that there isn't a big change. There's a bit of a decrease when we account for connectivity, but I was pretty excited about how small that change was. The biggest change is actually at 5% of the landscape, and it's a 3.6% decrease in the average amount of biodiversity that's represented. These dashed lines show the minimum proportion represented for the feature that is least well represented. That might be changing over time. So that wasn't too bad, but we get, for that small decline in biodiversity, we get really a big increase in the upstream connectivity. So we're really managing to actually have quite a big impact, and we're getting up to sort of like 95% upstream connectivity here. So really a high proportion of upstream areas controlled. That's pretty great. So, you know, hopefully that's really reducing the chance of downstream dispersal. So I would say that sort of in general, we've got a sort of similar effect on biodiversity protection and a real improvement in our upstream connectivity. So that's pretty great, like win-win. How about seed dispersal potential? So this is the map showing the areas of high seed dispersal potential. The pink areas are the high areas and the green areas are the lower areas. It was just predicted along the major waterways. So you can see the high areas of high seed dispersal potential around Falls Creek and other alpine areas, and also in this northeast of this region, just west of Myrtleford. So Myrtleford's about here. So for this region, these are the priorities if we just have, if we just think about biodiversity. And then this is if we have a sort of low weight for seed potential, or it's actually considering it as the same weight as a biodiversity feature. So just an extra, thinking of it as an extra species. And then this is if we weight seed potential more highly. And so you can see that what happens here is we go from, we have pretty similar effort sort of across the alpine areas, but we go from focusing in this southwest region more towards the northeast, and then when we weight it more highly, really towards the northeast, this big seed dispersal area. So you can see there's a bit of a trade-off between the locations that are considered a priority for biodiversity and some of the locations that are considered a priority for dispersal. And that's reflected when we look at the trade-off on the performance. So with just the one, like with seed not too highly, minimising seed dispersal threat not too high, you can see that there's not a very big decline. So again, this decline is quite small, just sort of 2 to 3%. And the increase here, so at 10%, this increase is about 20%, and it increases as we manage a larger proportion of the landscape. But if we weight seed dispersal really highly, you can see that trade-off really develops. And actually this decline here is about 13% in the average representation. So, you know, it's really now, although we're getting a big increase in how much seed dispersal threat we're managing, we're actually getting a big cost for our current representation. And so for this purple option, the seed ×1, the sort of similarly equal priority, maybe that's a pretty good trade-off. You know, we're getting similar biodiversity protection and seed dispersal, so that's really positive. But as it gets stronger, that trade-off's bigger and bigger. So we wouldn't be wanting to embark on any planning using a really high weighting, I think, without looking quite a lot more carefully at the specific details, which species or elements of biodiversity are sort of being missed out in that prioritisation, and do those areas of high seed dispersal potential really, are they really as high potential as we're estimating? So just in summary, you know, like, this is pretty amazing, right? This is pretty awesome that we could control for so much future dispersal potential without really having much of an impact on biodiversity. So in both cases, we could identify, you know, we could shift our control locations a little bit, like tweak them a bit, and get great co-benefits of protecting biodiversity and reducing future dispersal. Of course, if we focus too much on future dispersal in that seed case, we really started to see costs, and then in that case, obviously, we want to think differently. That's pretty exciting. I'm stoked, actually. It's unusual to have such a weak trade-off, actually. So what am I talking about? What am I going to work on in ARI? I'll just very briefly talk about these two things. So one is with Rachel, we're working with Tracy as well and a bunch of other people to develop tools for wetland risk assessment. So this is a map of about the 40,000 mapped wetlands in Victoria, but about less than 500 have had formal risk assessments so far. So this project is all about trying to build the data, the models and the tools that will enable the DELP Wetlands Group to be able to do more comprehensive risk assessments for wetlands. The second thing is thinking about how we incorporate uncertainty and error into our decisions. So all decisions involve predicting the future. All predictions of the future have error and uncertainty. And how do different kinds of error affect this decision? And we're starting with working on a project that's addressing these issues in the context of thinking about how decisions based on measures derived from habitat distribution models, so things like area of occupancy or range size, are going to be affected by the different kinds of error and uncertainty that are generated when we fit these habitat suitability models. So thanks very much.
More applause from across the nation, Jos. Thank you so much, and gorgeous picture to end with. Oh my goodness, like I can see why you're so stoked and excited, because like how incredibly useful is this work to help us make the decisions that we need to when we have limited resources to do this work, and we need to make the right decisions about what we're going to do and where we're going to do it and what will be most effective and what kind of other impacts there might be. So incredibly useful work and really interesting, and also interesting for us to see that other application of zonation, given that lots of people in the audience here, I think, would be, you know, knowing about the SMP application there. That's really interesting. The other thing that I think is fabulous is that focus on uncertainty and error, particularly as, you know, the world changes around us and continues to change. This is going to be increasingly useful and important. Thank you so much. Now, Andy, I think we might have a few questions here in the chat. Would you like to take us through them? Thank you. You happy to take some questions, Jos?
Yeah, of course.
Great.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Jos. First question is around willows being so extensively dispersed. The question is, I guess, around the next steps from your research. How do you engage private landholders to make them aware of this issue and motivate them to take action against willows, I guess? And are there any alternatives you might recommend private landholders to use for similar purposes you described around the initial thoughts around erosion control?
Yeah, for sure. So I think in terms of erosion control, I think I would be, yeah. So I can't sort of name specific species, I guess, but I would be encouraging people to sort of try to recreate the sort of more native vegetation. So a lot of this need for erosion control was actually caused by widespread vegetation land clearing. And so like revegetating with sedges or grasses and then interspersed with sort of slower growing shrubs to revegetate is what I would recommend, because actually, although the very high speed of willows is very popular, they do very quickly form large problems as well. And I guess that's I would say is probably the major sort of very obvious issue for everyone, is that the clogging up of the willows in the waterways, I think is something that's an issue for landholders everywhere.
Thanks so much, Joss.
Andy, I'm just going to jump in and say yes to what Joss said, and also say, you know, ARI has been involved for many years in demonstration reaches in rivers in the north of the state. And one of the things that we've learned really powerfully in those projects is the role of social norming and neighbours. So, you know, where we've worked
I can imagine
with some particular neighbours and helped them understand the impact of willows, and they've transitioned their property and their riparian zone to be native. And then when other neighbours have seen what's happening over the fence there, it's really spread that change in behaviour and attitude to willows, both upstream and downstream, in really positive and productive ways. So the power of the influence of a neighbour is pretty impressive. Yeah. Sorry, Andy, I jumped in, couldn't resist making it a conversation. Go for it.
Like, it's funny because willows were being recommended, right, by government until the 80s, and then it was sort of no, and then some of the early control was sort of pretty much scorched earth, which resulted in erosion, and so it was kind of like a bit of a rocky transition. I think it's great having those kinds of demonstrations, because it's key to have vegetation, right? You need vegetation to limit erosion. And being able to make that transition is super important.
That's right.
Very core message there, I think. Just one last question we'll ask, and it's around the future work you're doing at ARI around wetland risk assessments. The person was just asking, can you tell us a little bit more about the type of risk you'll be looking at? And I'm going to merge it with another question. Is climate change being considered as a risk in this alpine work?
Oh, which alpine work? So, so for the wetlands, so at the moment, So I think one of the measures of that is being currently trying to be developed for the wetlands, for like the big statewide wetland tools, is a sort of measure of changing sort of water availability, sort of like by trying to look at and changing sort of fluctuating changes in water area over time, that I think will be able to indicate risk in that respect, sort of like how, if that's responding to sort of changing water regimes. I think at this point we're really working on trying to get together the information on those wetlands that currently exists and setting up a framework that will enable different groups of people to sort of like look at that information and assess it. And then later on, we'll be looking more into that.
Awesome. Thanks, Joss.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Joss. Look, there's more questions there. There's so many things that we could keep talking about this, particularly when you start thinking about climate change in the Alps. And there's certainly other things where ARI is looking at different animals that live in the Alps and the likely impacts of habitat there. So there's lots that we could continue to talk about. I'm very mindful that we've come up to time though, so I'm going to encourage people to continue those conversations via email or other mechanisms.
Yep,
Please
very happy.
Terrific. Thank you so much to you, Jos, for your talk today. Rachel, for your wonderful talk as well. Please, audience, get in touch with these women with more questions if you want to continue the conversation. And thanks, Andy, for tech today. And please, everyone, come back and join us again for our next ARI seminar, which I think, Andy, I'm going to check, is it the 4th of April with Kate Lee and Rose McCauley?
You're right on the money there, Thad.
Yes, great. Really looking forward to that one as well. It's not far away. Please also join us for that. Keep well, everyone. Travel safe. Thanks so much for joining us today. Thanks to everyone who came along, asked questions, and particularly to our presenters. Thank you. Thanks so much.